I mean, I was not as smart on Twitter, and that was my primary problem.
Canary Mission existed before October 7th? How long has Canary Mission been doxing people?
They've been doxing people since like the mid 2000s, I think.
Oh my god!
Just out.
What the fuck?
Yeah, I think they came together in like the mid 2010s. I want to say. I don't know the exact details of the org, but yeah, no, it's pretty fucked. Like they they got me, my fiance, a bunch of other PYM guys.
Oh my god.
Yeah, but I mean, it used to be a lot worse. Now it's like kind of nothing because like their whole infrastructure, like people kind of know Canary Mission's a crank site, so like people don't really take it into as much consideration unless you're working in like I guess government jobs or something. But like I'm not doing that, so
yeah,
you know, it's not a huge deal.
Yeah, my bosses are all boomers, so like even if I did get like doxed, like they'd just be like, "What the fuck is going on?" You know.
It's kind of a win.
Yeah.
Honestly, yeah. No, I mean, for me, I work with two other guys in a small little like workers co-op, like web builder thing. And
oh, nice.
We don't make a whole lot of money off it, but like they both are like fuck Israel too. So like they thought it was funny. They're like, sure, dude, yeah, get doxed.
I'm amazed I haven't gotten doxed yet. Honestly, I am not that careful. I need to be more careful. Honestly, I have a lot of like just shit online where like if you tried hard enough, you could dox me. But
yeah, well, you were getting into it with that one creator who does like architecture and artwork stuff.
Seema, yeah,
I saw that.
I got into like a fight.
That was funny.
Yeah. I mean, it was a really small fight. Honestly, it was like we were both kind of wrong because I misinterpreted what she was saying, and she also misinterpreted what I was saying. So it was just like we both kind of lost that fight. Yeah, but I wanted to have like a good conversation out of it, like what is indigenous, what is colonization, but
right.
I just feel like I wasn't met with good faith, you know, whatever. Yeah.
I mean, I made a video kind of covering it in like the lightest way I could. And there were a lot of people in the comments who were saying they either got blocked by her or whatever. And it's just like, all right, well, it's probably not going to be a productive combo.
It's not a very productive combo, no. I don't think Seema is really oh yeah, I began recording like a minute ago, by the way, if that's okay.
You're chilling. Yeah, it's all good.
Okay. Yeah, Seema, I don't know. She's very educated. She's like very smart.
Oh yeah. Great content generally.
I know, but like sometimes she just sort of acts in bad faith, like saying that the Palestine-Israel issue is thousands of years old and not like 1948-ish. Like that's crazy.
Yeah.
In my opinion.
Yeah, no, it's always funny to me, this like Zionist mythology of like, oh, like this has just been a thing and it'll always be a thing. When it's like, no, like you can like literally trace this back to like 1884. Like it'll like the first colonization under the Ottoman like period. Like you can trace this back to like literally a period of time, even in the like in 48, where people are just older than the actual project. Like there are Palestinians who remember a time before Israel, and that's like the craziest thing to me. It's like they're like, no, it's just always been a thing. And it's like, dude, I know like 80-year-old Palestinians who are like or older than this project. Like it's ridiculous to me.
I know. Also, it's not even like a religious fight. Like there's Christian Palestinians. No. Like, you know, like it's not like Muslim versus Jew. It's like the dude who shot.
It's funny too. Like the settler populations in early like like I guess like pre-Yishuv, like so-called Israel, like these early Zionist settlers were like lobbying the Ottomans to create different classifications between them and like the indigenous Jewish populations, because they're like, that's not us.
Yeah,
it's like
the Mizrahi.
No, well, yes, I guess technically now it's just like the Palestinian Jewish population.
Oh, okay.
From my understanding, Mizrahi is like kind of a Israeli invented term, which is interesting. I think, which I think it like roughly translates like literally into like Oriental Jew or something, which is like ridiculous. But like it's like basically the indigenous Palestinian population and the Jewish populations internally, who even during the Nakba like were harassed and harmed by like Zionist militias in some instances. Like I don't know why. It's an interesting project, I guess. It's probably the white supremacist elements playing in, but
I did a video on a paper by a professor, and he was talking about how the Mizrahi or indigenous Palestinian Jews, they were basically treated as second-class citizens by the
Absolutely. Yeah.
European ones. People refused to sit next to them. They were considered a little bit higher than Muslim Palestinians, but they were still not equal to the European Jews, which is insane.
Yeah. Yeah, and even within like European like Jewish populations that came over, like there were distinct differences between like Ashkenazi and otherwise. I'm losing the Spanish Jewish descendantry term, but it's interesting that like and Israelis bicker over this a lot as well. Is that for years, especially under labor, you had this sort of like Ashkenazi, kibbutzim dominated, like social caste. Like labor was dominated overwhelmingly by Ashkenazis. A lot of the military officer roles, in other areas like that, were very much pulled from like kibbutzim members. It's like very interesting how that's played, and like Likud is primarily non-Ashkenazi now. And that kind of racial dimension, or that kind of, I guess, what have you, dimension is pronounced even within like Israeli social castes. I think that's very interesting.
Yeah.
They all hate Palestinians. And I would argue that like the Likud party is a reaction to like labor has actually become obviously way more openly fascistic than their labor counterparts. But it's interesting nonetheless to see how they like, there's internal social bickering over these things.
I don't even know how Jewish communism even worked, or like Zionist communism. Of course, like Jewish communism would be a different.
Yeah. Like the kind of like social Zionism. Yeah, it's interesting. Like I read a book on this. I can't remember which it was. It was like Palestinians from Peasants to Revolutionaries or something by Don Pape. It was a really good analysis of like, it might have been False Prophets of Peace might have been the area it was. And the author talks a lot about how like Zionists framed themselves as being socialist because they were like, well, we have kibbutzes, like we have this kind of like self-sustaining social what have you. And a lot of the early Zionists were fleeing from like, not fleeing from, really creating settlement movement patterns from like Eastern, really predominantly Central in Western Europe initially. But later Eastern Europe, and you have this kind of wanting of labor to be socialist without addressing the kind of colonial dynamic. And what you end up finding long term, at least from what I've seen, is that these sort of labor Zionists were really socialist in name only, and were really willing to use like socialist aesthetics while maintaining a pretty brutal like project that was very antithetical. Like socialist exactly project building.
Yeah, exactly right. Like Pape, the quote I remember is, Palestinians didn't care if the boot pressing down on their necks was holding the Torah or the Book of Marx. You know, it's a really good quote. And it's just like, to build an ethnic state in the name of socialism, where, like one population is suffering for your own socialism, like an ethnic outsider, that's just fascism. Like,
oh, literally.
I'm sorry, but to take a socialist aesthetic and to use that to benefit one section of the population over another ethnicity or outgroup, that is just fascism. Like,
yeah, you're just doing fascism. And that's like the crazy thing about it is like you'll still get this kind of like red washing in Zionist circles of being like, no, but like consider the kibbutzes. And it's like, yeah, like, but who works in those?
Yeah.
Like who like whose land is that on? Like there's so many kibbutzes that are around Gaza in the Gaza envelope that functionally just operate as like military bases. So it's military
like bases or help colonize Gaza, like land. Like
it's like, what are we doing here, guys? Like I don't know. Like Zionist rhetoric and propaganda is so unbelievably lazy and flimsy as it stands, at least the majority of it. And it's just funny to see that kind of dynamic still playing out like post 67.
I know. Okay. Hello guys. We're on today with James Ray. James does politics on TikTok. Wait, was it James does politics?
James gets political. What you're talking
James gets political. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. He's my favorite TikTok creator. I don't remember his name though. I remember his face. I love his videos, but I do not. I'm so bad with names. I'm sorry. I'm studying HD.
I'm the same way. Don't worry about it.
I'm so dyslexic. I swear to God. Oh my God. And no, really, like one time I did like a college report on a history book because I was a history major, and I fucking hated that book so much. When I finished it, I forced myself to read it, and when I wrote down the essay and I've turned it into my professor, he read over my essay and he was like, "Did you read the book?" I was like, "Yeah." He's like, "Cause you just made up a different book." Like he sat down with me. He's like, "I've read this book. This dude is the dude who wrote it is my colleague, and you made up a different book and wrote an essay on a made up book." I'm like, "Shit, dude. I fucking
Like, sorry.
I read it so badly, I accidentally created a whole different historical narrative." Yeah. But favorite political content creator, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi everybody. I guess I'm James Gets Political. My name's James Ray. I am an organizer well, I'm an organizer in multiple cities across the country at this point, but doing a lot of work on the East Coast, trying my best to advance the cause of Palestinian liberation through political commentary, education, on-the-ground organizing efforts. It's been a fun ride. I've been doing this for a couple of years and I'm just happy to be here.
Yeah. Yeah. Could you describe how you became a leftist? That's always my favorite question.
Yeah. Well, that was like a mixture of different factors. I grew up in a predominantly conservative community, not like predominantly, like in southern Indiana, there's a city called Evansville, where I grew up and spent the most of my years. Evansville, like from an electoral perspective, is called like the Bloody Eighth historically in Indiana because it's kind of a swing district, like the district it's in, as well as like adjoined districts. But the majority of the people that I was around were either lukewarm Democrats or very conservative. My family being mostly conservative, save for like a Blue Dog Union Dem or something here and there.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and early on, I was very inundated in the conservative rhetoric because it's all I knew. Until I started coming through and seeing, mostly weirdly enough, like my transition beyond like kind of right wing politics was through like Jon Stewart and other like liberal commentators who at the time.
Mm-hmm.
were doing a lot to dispel conservative rhetoric, and I was kind of coming home from school watching it and being like, oh, okay, I'm hearing this, I'm seeing this, and by 2016 I'm like a senior in college or senior in high school, sorry, and the Bernie campaigns comes into full swing, which kind of made me reevaluate core questions that I had. Not to say Bernie like made me a socialist, but like he at least made me think like, oh yeah, like I should probably get college and healthcare. Like that seems fair that I shouldn't go into massive amounts of debt for those things. And through college, I was really more of, I think, a democratic socialist, save for Palestine, where I maintained very radical views just because of conversations I had with close friends of mine living in Palestine, and that kind of reality. And I guess towards the end of my college career, my like junior year, I went abroad and spent a summer in Germany that also entailed me studying Eastern European and Southeastern European relations with the European Union, which, long story short, are not great. The EU kind of fucking sucks if you're Eastern European or from the Balkans.
Yeah.
And so like going over to Serbia, to Bosnia more specifically.
Oh, you went to the Balkans?
Oh yeah. I spent some time in Bosnia and a shorter time in Serbia.
And you didn't become
really
racist? It made you a socialist and not racist?
Yeah, no, it made me a big Tito guy. But yeah, like I'm like a Titoist now. It's whatever. But no,
nice.
I think basically like when I was in Bosnia and like Sarajevo and Srebrenica, I learned that I kind of contextualized a lot of education that I had been doing at the time, not just with like economic exploitation from like a sort of like European core versus like what I would describe more as like a European periphery, but also like kind of diving into a lot of genocide studies, which I had like had a regained interest in or a renewed interest in later in my college career. And going through Bosnia, it's kind of hard not to see the direct and really horrific effects of U.S. and Western imperialism and exploitation. So coming back, I was kind of primed, and I didn't really know what to call myself. I knew I didn't like Democratic politics or policy. I knew I didn't like Republican politics or policy. And by the time I come back, it's about 2020, about a year after we get into 2020, and all of a sudden I'm seeing COVID, our government, the way they're handling it. I'm seeing, a lot of violence on the streets, going out in the Black Lives Matter uprisings, being a part of several of the protests that had occurred in Indiana and Kentucky. And sort of meeting this like direct brutality towards what I at the time even really thought were pretty understandable and very moderate asks, like just like not having police kill people.
Yeah.
And so that really started me down a path where I ended up between the uprising in 2020 and the COVID lockdown that forced me onto TikTok out of sheer boredom. I started picking up a lot of literature, a lot of stuff primarily by Lenin, and then a lot of history material around Palestine, and it sort of re-engaged my radicalization around Palestine. But using that, I was able to branch out and kind of understand kind of like Leninist talking points and ideological preconceptions. And then I read Wretched of the Earth, which I think is what kind of flipped the switch to the degree in which I was like, okay, yeah, no, I'm a communist for sure. And that's kind of how I got here. And past that, it's just been the more you organize in the streets, the more you look at what's going on. I look at like Marxism as like a science as being a really interesting. It's like taking the wool off of your eyes in a lot of ways, and you can't really put it back over, right? It's like,
Absolutely.
it's like you're like living under a blanket, and like you take it off, you're like, oh fuck, there's like a whole bedroom here.
Absolutely.
And like it just like everything I see, it's like, okay, now I know how to attribute this to X. I know why this is moving the way it is, or I can like ascertain and like make connections here and there, and the more connections get made, the more just kind of reinforce my positions. And I went from being, I think, a fairly liberal TikToker, I think, in the initial period, at least from what my fiance tells me, to being much more radical in analysis in my organizing strategies, things of that nature. So that maybe is a really long-winded answer, but that's kind of how I got here.
No, it's excellent. Imagine being called a liberal by your fiance. Oh my God.
No, she actually she jokes with me about this a lot, where she says that when she first met me, I was definitely a liberal except for Palestine, and it was very funny.
Oh my God.
Because she was like, yeah, you were like weirdly, you were like anti-Trump and like you were anti-Biden, but not like, but kind of like the uncommitted movement, I guess right now. It's like similar wave where it's like, no, we can still push him left or whatever.
Oh yeah.
And then, yeah, and then like, but like you talking to me about Palestine, I was like, no, like Israel's definitely got to burn to the ground. It definitely is that's the only real solution there. And she was like, oh, okay. So she stayed around long enough to.
She saw the contradiction playing out in your mind, and she was like, "Oh,
Yeah, she
I
was
know
like,
which side
give
is
him like
gonna
a
win."
couple of months. She'll toss me a book here and there. She's like, just check this out. Like,
It's funny.
you got me to read some Stalin, and I was like, hang on out of that. I was like, oh, okay, cool. Yeah, no, fuck this. This is terrible. Like,
Oh, I don't know why people say Stalin's a bad writer. I fucking love his collected
great.
works. It's so good.
I think
it's so
of the stuff I've read. No, like the stuff I've read from Stalin, like incredibly accessible. Lenin too, to be honest. Like, although Lenin for me is a little bit less accessible than Stalin, because I always joke about how like Lenin, like so I have like a degree in econ and poli sci, which is kind of a joke, but also at least helps me with the econ side of like kind of understanding political economy a little bit. And it's fun reading Lenin because like I can understand how he's thinking about these things, and as he's like reading or he's going through like economic data and like tracing all these things out. But also like the thing that it's difficult, I think, and I see this primarily with, like State and Rev, was that if you're not someone who already is kind of a nerd for like Russian history, it does have barriers because like a lot of Lenin's critiques and writings are him just like bitching at or criticizing his contemporaries.
Absolutely.
And yeah, and so like for me, like I had already at the time I was listening to like Revolutions, like the podcast by Mike Duncan that really covered the Bolshevik Revolution and really in depth, like reading about like Russian history. So like when I get into when I start reading State and Rev, I'm like, oh, I know these guys. I get this. Like this makes sense. But I suggested to other people, and they're like, "Who the fuck is this person?" And I'm like, "No, that's a good point. I don't know. Like,
Who the fuck is Bernstein? Who the fuck is Kerensky?
yeah, it's like, well, let me give you like a 30-part or 50-part podcast series so you can break down like who this guy is. Like it's like it's interesting. But Stalin did straight to the point. I think Mao too.
Mao and Stalin are the most beautiful writers in my opinion. Yeah, especially Mao. He writes such clearly, so simply. Takes like these very complicated concepts that like sometimes a person with like a PhD in like philosophy would need to understand, and he writes it in like a way that like a Chinese peasant who's like just learned how to read can like understand. Like I think he's just absolutely beautiful writer.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, and then also like others like Fanon is my personal favorite as far as like writings go. Although I made the mistake of like reading Wretched of the Earth is like my first real like piece of like socialist or like quote unquote leftist like literature in theory. And so I was like, what the fuck is a lumpen proletariat? Like I don't know what's going on here, but I like the vibe. And then I had to like reread a bunch of books after I started reading more Lenin and being like, oh, okay, this makes more sense now. This I can connect this in my head.
Yeah,
There's a lot of really good, great literature on the left. Like I just swear.
absolutely, absolutely. And then like, what do the fascists have? Like Mein Kampf or something? It's so
got, like,
fucking
Mussolini.
ugly. That book is so boring. Like honestly, it's just
Oh, I mean, like, and that's like Mussolini's writings, and it's like, oh, this is all just kind of ass. Like I don't know,
yeah, yeah.
like fascists are fascinating to me because like they don't really have any like art. I mean, they do. There's like fascist architectural design in the Mussolini, but like it's all kind of shit. And like and like a lot of their like when you look at like modern day like fascist or neo-fascist concepts like or conceptualizations like cartoons, think that like writings, it's all just kind of shit. Like I don't know how it like brings people in. Like it's not good.
I think shit. I Dutt was his name. He wrote Fascism and Social Revolution, and he really put it well. He said that like fascism isn't really an ideology; it's just an explanation for the bourgeois taking power. Like it's an explanation like shittily slapped on for the bourgeois and the most reactionary elements of society taking power. And like when I read that, I was like, you are fucking right in every single way. Because I think fascism is completely aesthetic. Completely fucking aesthetic. It's I look better than you. I hate migrants, and then the theory, whatever theory there is just an add-on. Like it's just an add-on to justify.
Like, let me develop some semblance of a framework to understand like why capitalism in crisis is like cracking down on you and breaking your door down. Like,
absolutely, absolutely, and it's never very consistent. I mean, like Hitler went from saying, I love Lenin and Marx to like, I'm gonna kill all the Leninists and Marxists. Like it was never very consistent.
Well, and it's funny too because like people don't realize this, I think, but like even fascists themselves can't really agree on like what path to choose. And Europe's a really funny example. Terrifying but funny because like none of the fascist camps really get along. Like Le Pen, Maloney, the AfD in Germany, they all like kind of fucking don't like each other. It's like really entertaining to watch like internally like intra-fascist squabbling. Because they're all just like different strains of whatever they had to say or do to justify their localized leadership.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. But let's get into some questions now. Let's get into some juicy things. All right. Why do you think America needs an Israel?
That's a really good question. I mean, it's a couple of different things. I think primarily it's that it's very easy for the U.S. to export a lot of the negative externalities onto a foreign body in a way that helps us avoid potential crises at home. Because if there's one thing Americans like Israelis, if there's one thing we don't like, it's seeing body bags come back that are American. It's seeing soldiers, casualties. It's seeing devastation in families, what have you. So at least some families. Doesn't matter most of the time, but like you get these like Iraq, I think, and Afghanistan are good examples where it's just like the amount of casualties coming back really rock a lot of firmly held expectations and beliefs to their core and force I think even people who otherwise support imperialism in the U.S. To reevaluate like the efficacy of the program in a way that they don't have to when all we're doing is giving a couple of billion here and there to a foreign entity that like might be a little problematic, but is still going to fundamentally uphold our interests in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
It's easier for Israelis to die for U.S. imperialism than it is for like a Marine. And I think also like geographically, it's just useful for us. Like in the Israeli context is useful for the same reason the Brits saw the Israelis as useful. It's like they not only are in a region that has resources and capital that we would like to exploit, that we would like to take, but also their unique geopolitical, like their unique geographic position allows them to create a sort of bulwark that continually maintains an opening up like canal systems and areas similar to it give us like an unfettered ability to continue commerce through these zones in a way that we might have to not have should we not have client states and imperialist outposts in the region. Like without a Saudi, without an Egypt, without an Israel, without a Jordan, like a lot of, we have to negotiate a lot more. And it's easier to just have a foreign entity that shares a lot of our goals, do the dirty work.
Absolutely. I think America has always been very good at systematizing fascism. That's what I'll say. Like, fascism in America has never been like it was in Italy and Germany, where it was very out in the open, very honest. America is very good at pulling the wool over people's eyes, hiding the truth, hiding the bodies. And I think your answer's just spot on the money. I mean, every single contradiction of Israeli society is a contradiction of American society. I mean, Southern colonial state, colonial state, a war, endless imperialism needed for, oil. Like, oil is the lube. I'm sorry for that, but oil is the lube of the capitalist system, right? Like, everything runs on oil. That's why the Middle East is so important. But if it was us occupying, Palestine and not the Israelis, like, you wouldn't have be able to pull the wool over the eyes as easily. But yeah, no, you're absolutely right.
Well, and we have Lebanon as an example for that too. Like, the U.S. tried to assist the occupation of Lebanon, and the minute that the barracks bombing occurred and the soldiers started getting picked off by Shia militants, like, we dipped. Like, we pulled out because the casualties and the image that was sending was antithetical to our goals. It's a shame that same thing isn't playing out at like Conoco oil fields or whatever in Syria and in Iraq. But it's interesting nonetheless that like U.S. power is incredibly fragile in a lot of ways. And the U.S. like military invincibility, this idea of military invincibility is, like you said, very similar to so-called Israel's, and that like we can't afford it to be seriously challenged. Because should our military invincibility be challenged, should our ability to wage war and dominate markets be challenged, then the system that we've maintained begins crumbling.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think America is just, it needs a little bit of consent from its population for anything.
Mm-hmm.
For anything, like a little bit popular consent. And when it gets too honest, it can no longer do that. Like, as evil as American, it is evil. Everything about the system is evil, but it does have like a couple self-regulation methods here and there for like, and it's not because it cares about people or humanity, but just to like keep the system surviving as long as it can. Because if it allows too much greed, if it allows too much things like that, like the system self-destruct. And so, like in the Vietnam War, you saw like, oh, we'll try President Nixon. What the hell? Like we'll allow you to get CIA classified files every 5 years from 20 years ago. What the hell? Like, just it allows itself to self-regulate for longevity, right? And I think Israel is part of that, right? Israel, we can self-regulate ourselves by exporting all our issues to Israel. Right, like we don't. Then it's not our issue; it's the Israelis' issue, and we're just helping them. Right, like it's just things like that.
Absolutely, and it's so much cheaper for like real. Like I'd say, I'm arguing about Ukraine is it's just so much cheaper for the United States and ultimately very profitable for U.S. military contractors to be able to export all of the arms, all of the military and economic aid, etc., into these projects, into these efforts, rather than risking a single U.S. boot, like a non like special forces operations boot on the ground.
Yeah.
Because we have boots on the ground in these things. It's just like a matter of like what role they're playing. But we don't have like your standard issue like military. Like we don't have like the army or the Marines rolling up on the shores of Gaza. Because like that would be really bad. It would not end well. And it would also open up the U.S. to a lot of internal criticisms and problems. It could create larger ripple effects, and it's so much easier to let the Israelis like run into Gaza and get themselves fucking murked than it is for us to continually send forces over there beyond advisors and all of the special stuff we're sending.
Yeah, and no matter who wins or loses, America wins at the end of the day. Like, if America lost its military objectives in Iraq and Afghanistan, but it still won because it made money through just through the blowback, just through the military-industrial complex. Like, even when America loses, it still wins because war in America is no longer about winning or military objectives. It's just about funneling capitalist glut. If you're familiar with Seeson's theory of capitalist glut, a capitalist always has extra capital that he needs to invest in, so he invested with an imperialist military machinery. It's just a good outlet for capitalist glut, pretty much.
Yeah. Especially because the military-industrial complex in the United States is one plagued by like inefficiencies, bloated budgets, substandard delivery. It's very interesting. There's a book I've been reading lately called like the U.S. War Machine, I think, where it talks a lot about failures of the U.S. military-industrial complex that are really resultant from the way that it is developed and kind of how those ripple effects have influenced U.S. industry, how it's led to outcomes for U.S. soldiers, the outcomes that it's led to populations that we are directly invading and occupying. It's all very interesting. But yeah, no, we just dump in an increasingly significant amount of money into this military industrial complex. And like post Afghanistan, as we were eyeing the withdrawal, there was a lot of fear amongst contracting bodies that that would lead to a reduction in overall spending, even though like if you look year to year, minus temporary fluctuations, we've pretty much never seen a real decrease, save for maybe a little bit under the Obama admin that didn't even really hit a sizable threshold. And it's interesting that, you know, as soon as, you know, we start looking at that potential downturn, Ukraine occurs, we get what's going on in Gaza, and in this military industrial complex takes advantage of those things, begins lobbying intensively. Like the invasion of Crimea was a godsend for the MIC. You know, at least in terms of being able to export and develop more arms and create more contracts. Even though U.S. military hardware and shit has been getting increasingly technologically sophisticated, but possibly less effective in a lot of ways, which I think is also a very interesting conversation.
Yeah, I think this is one of the most easily insane empires in history, because at this point it doesn't even care about winning. It doesn't even care about winning, like in terms of military strategy and wars. All it cares about is just keeping its money machine, its money cycle going. Like as long as the money goes towards the right people in the right hands and greases the right hands, it doesn't matter if America wins or loses a war, if its allies win or lose a war. America wins at the end of the day just through greasing its wheels with money. You know, it's insane. It really is.
Mm-hmm. It's a whole thing, and it's just crazy how the system works to both reinforce itself, and how our military-industrial complex in particular like acts as this like sort of living being that acts to constantly defend and reinforce its own interests and assets, which is very neat.
Yeah, it's almost got a mind of its own.
Yeah,
pretty much. But you know, speaking of Obama and you know, false promises, things like that, do you think that Democrats are better imperialists than Republicans?
I don't know. I think it depends. Like, I think both of them play different sides of the same coin, right? It's the same game.
Yeah.
You see it a lot in like Iraq, I think, is a good example, or U.S. Operations in, I don't know, I want to say Kosovo, where you have this differentiation between like the rhetoric utilized for invasion and intervention, right? Like on the liberal side, you have always, especially post 9/11, had this sort of like humanitarian interventionalist lean. Even in the 90s, you see this in the 80s as well. I mean, I guess it's really not post 9/11. It's really been there for a long time. This sort of humanitarian interventionalist mentality of like, we need to go in and we need to topple this government. We need to do this thing because like we have to free these people from their suffering, and we have to stop this thing from happening. Now, interestingly enough, it never actually fucking happens when actual genocides are occurring, save for like maybe very limited instances. But it's very intelligently deployed, particularly by Democrats, as a means for creating consent for invasion, for military operations, for the toppling of governments.
Yeah.
You know, for the imposition of sanctions and things like that. Republicans, on the other hand, are more of like hammers, where they'll kind of say similar things, but they're a lot more explicit about the defense of U.S. interests, about U.S. national security needs. And Democrats will talk the same talk on national security. But I've always found Republicans to be a little bit more heavy-handed with how they're, you know, with their reasoning than I have Democrats. Democrats will, you know, getting back to like a Malcolm X quote, Democrats will give you all sorts of reasons, essentially, for why they're doing what they're doing, when they're functionally doing the exact same thing Republicans are wanting to do for the exact same reasons. They're just smart enough to mask their rhetoric. So I guess in that way, they're definitely a bit more effective for courting, I think, an audience that is increasingly apathetic to the idea of hardline maintenance of U.S. power abroad.
Yeah.
But Republicans still have their role in making sure that all of the worst of us are able to maintain our support for these interests. But I guess so. Yeah, I guess like in a short answer, isn't me just rambling. Yeah, in a lot of ways, Democrats provide, I think, are better at the game.
Absolutely.
Because they can give us reasons that make us feel good about what we're doing.
I mean, in my opinion, Democrats are sort of like the idealized imperialist. Like they're what the people in
Mm,
power want imperialism to be. Like very humanitarian seeming, very professional,
mm,
very doesn't step on too many toes. You know, like it makes it smoother when the person doing imperialism says that they love black people and gay rights. You know, like when they sort of
mhm.
follow that
Is a nicer, more inclusive imperialism.
yeah, absolutely. And but I think also the ruling classes, bourgeois, whatever you want to call them, absolutely need the Republicans sometimes to just come on in and just bring down the hammer. You know, like
Mm,
cut the shit, cut the bullshit, be more honest with the imperialism. But overall, I think Democrats are very good at pulling the wool over people's eyes because they're what imperialism wants to be, and Republicans are what imperialism needs to be.
mhm. Yeah,
Yeah,
I mean, and to another degree too, like Democrats are so good at demobilizing movements,
oh yeah,
and
absolutely.
it's another element that I found like in the Biden admin, um, that has just been really frustrating, and actually is it frustrated me a lot because we seem to have a lot of conversations, I think, around like what outcome for the presidential election is going to lead to better conditions for organizing. But like we've seen under Biden that a lot of the militancy and a lot of the on the street energy that we saw under like a Trump admin just disappeared because it was
Mhm.
very easy for people to say, oh, well, it's being handled. We have a Democrat in office. These things are getting better. Look at this. Look at this.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, you know, it's not really how it is. COVID is a great example. I think of that. Like we kind of just stopped giving a fuck about it once Biden got in office.
the
Um,
um the anti-ICE protests, the anti-people at the border
mhm.
protests. Like even my conservative town, people were downtown with signs saying like "Get the kids out of the facilities," things like that. And when it happened under Biden, nobody
Yeah.
gave a fuck. Nobody gave a fuck.
Well, and with the BLM uprisings, although I would argue that some of that's also just liberal co-option
Yeah,
of organic and sporadically energized cohorts. And that's maybe a failure of the left on some level, as well as like the results of a very deliberate effort by the U.S. government to defang a potentially very radical movement.
yeah,
But you also see like once Biden gets in office, he starts pushing for like the George Floyd Policing Act, which is like just an increase to police funding across the board. Does very little in terms of reforms, but he touted it as like the solution that people were looking for. And by the time that he got into office, energy was being lost. Energy was getting turned into more liberalized methods and strategies. And as such, like people just hit it, and a lot of people demobilized in a way that I found very interesting. And part of that might be that a lot of the core leadership, people who were doing a lot of work early on, especially black organizers and like Ferguson, were getting packed up, killed, arrested, whatever. Um, there was also just a really like it's like taking the wind out of the sails in a lot of ways, and I think that's very disheartening when you're looking at the current outcome potential.
yeah. I mean, the thing is, like BLM was like such a great movement, but it was also very contradictory. Like people within BLM could not really decide what exactly the strategy was, like against the
Mm,
government, fight the system, be entrenched within the government, work with the Democrats, don't work with the Democrats, we're internationalists, things like that. And I think it was a very spontaneous, it was a movement full of spontaneity. And, you know, movements full of
yes.
spontaneity are great. And
Mm.
I think BLM did great work. I'm not discounting any of the work that BLM did. It
Oh yeah,
was
I mean it improved the actual collective consciousness of so many fucking
absolutely,
people in such a short
absolutely.
time.
And but the thing with spontaneous movements is that they always fall into
Hmm.
reformism. They always get absorbed by
Yep.
the state. And I think that's what the Democrats essentially are. The Republicans are part of the state that represents all of the entrenched people within the hegemony, right? You
Hmm.
know, white people, male, straight people, and Democrats, they represent sort of a net for all the movements that challenge the hegemony, and their job is to systematize them, make them part of the hegemony. You know, radical
Hmm.
groups like gay people, Black Lives Matter, even radical movements like that. And their job is to grab those movements like a net and defang them, cut off their balls, take any revolutionary things that they had in them and just make them hollow shells of the state, essentially. And I think, unfortunately, that's happened even with BLM as they got co-opted by the Democrats.
Absolutely. I mean, and that's also, like, you know, again, like, it's this dual factor of like intense state repression that burned out or literally arrested, killed a ton of very radical and effective organizers.
Yeah.
Mixed with, like, I think a failure on a lot of the left. I know that there's been a lot of internal conversations in like DSA, for example, about how they were just completely unprepared for that sporadic movement. And as a result of that, there wasn't really a lot of massive left groups outside of like localized operations and maybe some counterexamples that were able to like take charge and really run the show in some ways. And that's not to say DSA was ever going to be the fucking vanguard, but like it's interesting that like that didn't materialize, and as such you get, you know, this kind of turn into like an NGO sort of model that is really unfortunate.
Yeah. I mean, like the 200 Maoists in the DSA might turn it into something. You never know, you know.
God willing, yeah.
They have I find that Maoist strategy so interesting. Just infiltrate the DSA, start your own like little chapters. That's such a it's very cool.
I mean, shit, like I didn't do infiltration, but in Philly, like I was part of the Communist Party, and a bunch of people split from the Young Communist League with me. Not like I wasn't like the catalyst.
Yeah.
Like there were a bunch of different grievances that went I think, unresolved that turned into a significant, like more than a dozen members leaving, you know, all joining DSA in Philly, which I thought was very interesting.
Yeah.
Made the chapter a little bit more left than it already was. I'd say that chapter in particular already has interestingly left roots, or at least interestingly left outgrowths. But yeah, I know you see that a lot. I think part of the thing is like you really in 2020 you didn't see a lot of people joining these new groups. DSA, for all intents and purposes, post 2020 is still about as white as it's ever fucking been. You know, the Communist Party is dealing with like a legacy of reformism under Broward and like a legacy of other, like, in my opinion, potentially catastrophic problems.
Yeah.
And then you have other organizations that just aren't able to meet the moment at the exact time. That's not to say there's not amazing fucking organizers in all of those organizations. But like it's just collectively the left didn't know what to do with that, and that's a shame. Even though there were amazing efforts. Yeah.
But I think as much as, you know, it was a failure, it also like showed so many people what to do next time. And I think with the Palestine protests that we're seeing, the left is a little bit better. The left is a little bit better at mobilizing and utilizing this energy for something more productive and actually getting something out of it. I think every single crisis sort of just teaches the American proletariat, leftist organizers, leftist groups, like how to wield this spontaneous energy into something greater than just fizzling out, you know, every single crisis point that we have. So
absolutely. I mean, there's always something to be learned, and I think that's the important thing. I always say that there's really no failure so much as setbacks, and you know, as long as you're willing to learn and adapt, and you know, it's hard to lose short of dying, but even then, you know.
Yeah. How did being in BLM shape you? Because you mentioned you were involved with them.
Yeah. I mean, well, being a part of like some of the street protests more than anything, I wasn't really organized as a socialist at the time. I was more so like I had a buddy of mine in Louisville, and I in Indiana knew there were protests going on when some of my buddies who were socialists at the time, before I really considered myself fully being one. Or at least knew what to call myself, I guess more so. A lot of them, you know, took me out to protest. I wanted to go out. I wanted to see what was going on in the streets. I was maybe a little bit adventurous. I didn't know what the fuck I was doing, but I knew I didn't like police really on principle. And then I got tear gassed for my first time, and I was like, oh, I really don't like police. And then, you know, I was like, oh, wow, these guys suck. So after my first really bad protest experience in Lafayette, Indiana, it changed my perception of policing as an institution. I already didn't really fuck with them, just by merit of seeing police in my hometown be dickheads. But like it was more of a like, oh, there's like a real structural critique to be made here. Going back, reading more literature afterwards helped contextualize that for me, I think.
That's
And
great.
then going into Louisville, around the like actually the day or two after the Breonna Taylor grand jury hearing, um, and before, because I was in Louisville a couple of times, seeing how the police were responding to again people that were just asking for very simple fucking things. Like at that point, it was like baseline accountability, right? And so I left that. I think more radicalized than I had been because in a lot of ways too, I was drawing connections with what I was seeing with things I had been studying in like in regards to Palestine, and so I was contextualizing it here, understanding the kind of subtler colonial elements present in the U.S. as well, as a colony ourselves, and in kind of reckoning with that. Also having, kind of learning more from and like engaging with people who were like indigenous organizers, particularly around like line 3, line 5, and kind of like, over those different periods, is seeing and hearing different things that I think got really contextualized very quickly the minute batons came out. So it's like all this stuff in my head, and I'm like, oh, right, shit, okay, cool. This is state repression. This makes sense. Yeah, I see what's going on here.
Yeah.
And I think coming out of that, I left much more radical and much more contextualized of things than I did when I came into it.
Yeah. Yeah. For me, BLM sort of showed to me that third world is this idea that the American proletariat is like sort of useless and the imperial core proletariat has nothing revolutionary to them. It's sort of disengaged third worldism, like that defeatist kind of third worldism, right? Like where like it lies completely on the shoulders of people in the global south and revolutions never coming here. It sort of deconstructed that because it showed that there is a kernel of something within the American working class that is radical, right? That is willing to stand up to the state, even if it is in spontaneous movements. There is something revolutionary about the American proletariat, and clearly the system is not working for them also. And so I think BLM was sort of like lightning in a bottle for just a lot of groundwork to be laid for future movements. That's what I'll say.
Agreed. And I think from my conversations with a lot of other organizers who were around and active at the time, it really reset a lot of our expectations around reformist strategies.
Yeah.
Helped us better understand like what the state is going to do when you really start to challenge it. And I think a lot of people that didn't get burned out after they left very much so wanting to tear down a lot of shit, and understandably so.
Yeah. It's just the less healthy everything gets, I think the more just radical these movements get, the more radical people become. So many
Absolutely.
people became communists out of the Vietnam War protests. Like Michael Parenti, that's where he first learned about Marxism. So I think for the first time, a lot of people are just challenging the narratives that they've been taught since they were kindergartners, right? Yep. Especially Gen Z, who were like babies during the Afghanistan war, really didn't know what was going on. And then, just really young generally. And for the first time, they're sort of seeing, oh my God, not only is my economic situation fucked, like I'm more than aware that if I go to college, I'm still fucked. I can't afford a home. But also that everything I've been taught about George Washington and freedom and yada yada is kind of wrong. Like everything I've been taught about the American hegemon.
Yeah, it's like a massive wake-up call to a lot of people who are otherwise typically very insulated from that violence. That's not to say that like everyone in the Imperial Corps, like I know plenty of working class Black organizers. I'm seeing just people who are, and especially indigenous organizers, and even like working class white organizers and white community members as well, who are really dealing with the brunt force of the system, but in a different way than the sort of militarized, hyper violent ways that we always see it in like Iraq. I think BLM kind of gave a fraction of that to a lot of people who didn't already understand police as like an occupational force, and that shifted perspectives for a lot of people, I would imagine.
Yeah. Of course, like it has to be a guided break with the system. Like, oftentimes people wake up from like, oh my God, the system is wrong. And then they go off in like a weird veering direction, like, conspiracy theories, crystal medicine, things like that.
Oh yeah.
You have to go down the right path. But I think a lot of people are in that gray zone where they're waking up for the first time that this isn't right, right? Like everything I've been taught, the hegemon isn't what I've been taught it's to be, basically. And I think they're waking up a little bit. They've been sort of in a dreamlike state. That's what I'll say.
I think that's a good way of describing it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's what Americanism is. It puts you into a dreamlike
Yeah.
state where it's just like
trance.
it's your
Yeah.
9 to 5. You flip on CNN, the world's you're shown like a very strange version of the world, but you're not able to see the truth, you know. And of course, the only truth is in the immortal science of Marxist-Leninism, Juche, you know.
Absolutely.
Yeah. But do you think like Israel and America are in healthy situations right now? Like where would you say these societies are?
Um, I would say the States I mean, a lot of people are recognizing more and more the kind of reality of the system that we have.
Yeah.
The same way that I think a lot of people recognize it during BLM, the issue you're going to run into, I think, long term is that like liberal tendencies have a tendency to take over movements. We're kind of seeing that in some elements with pieces of the Palestine liberation movement here. That's always been an ongoing problem, this fight between like grassroots organizations and NGO types. Kind of inside-outside strategy that oftentimes I think lends a lot more credence to people who want to work within like the Democratic Party, for example, than organizers who would rather break away from that kind of action entirely. But I don't know. The next couple of months and the next year, I think, are going to really determine the state of the United States in that regard. I do think that we're starting to see the kind of cracks, and we've started to see those cracks since well before October 7th even. And like that's a good thing. I think for the Israelis, it's a much different situation. I think Israeli civil society is collapsing, and I really do think that what we've seen since October 7th, especially, is the real beginning of the end for the colony, right? And we're seeing this violent, destructive spiral as the project continues to hemorrhage and continues to fracture. It's this idea of military invincibility that's so core to the sort of hyper masculine militaristic culture of the project has been utterly shattered by dudes in Adidas and flip flops. I mean, not to discount like the Al Qassam brigades and others; they're incredibly well trained operators. But like, it's just funny, like from the Israeli perspective, like these people who you thought were subhuman are just tanking your own military operatives.
Absolutely.
And
I mean, like the entire. I'm sorry for cutting you off, but the entire.
You're good.
Brunt of the Western world. It's so insane. The entire brunt of the Western world, like billions and billions of dollars, are being spent on like a couple to fight like a couple guys with like guns in a building, like flip flops, or like even like if they're well trained, like barely anything, like just a small handful of militias guys, you know, in buildings, and it's the entire brunt of this multi-billion-dollar machine is going against that. Like, hats off to the Al Qassam brigades. I mean, they must. Honestly, like they are the ghost that haunts the entire Western behemoth. It's insane. It's David versus Goliath.
And Palestinian resistance groups from Gaza to Jenin have consistently embarrassed Israeli occupiers and Israeli military. And when you have a project that not only is its entire existence predicated on this concept of military invincibility, of this being a David amongst a bunch of barbaric Arab Goliaths, but also a military-industrial complex that is an intelligence complex that is really built on this image. The project can't sustain itself in that way, and it's, you know, the Israelis are seeing themselves sending soldiers into what's a functional concentration camp and having them, you know, airlifted out in body bags, and that's a real consistent problem for the project. I think that coupled with the mass expulsion or the mass relocation of settlers in the north due to operators like Hezbollah, Syrian and Iraqi resistance factions as well, has been major. And I think that's also causing like a lot of contradictions and a lot of intensifications of existing contradictions. I think what we're seeing ultimately is the beginnings of the sort of death throes that you would expect from a settler society in collapse. The horrific part of that is like, when does it end? Like, when does the collapse occur? Like, is it now? Is it 10 years from now? And that's harder to predict. I'd say it's within our lifetimes, both optimistically, I think is a sober analysis of the conditions. But it's also going to be dependent on whether or not the U.S. is willing to continue sending like every piece of hardware the Israelis need to continue, because the Israelis really can't sustainably maintain their occupation without U.S. military and economic aid. But the U.S. right now is perfectly fucking willing to continue sending everything they need. Like we've sent over 500 shipments of aid, total military supplies totaling over like 50,000 tons since a couple of days ago. We're sending billions of dollars in aid, not even including the intelligence gathering support and other support that we are assuredly giving on the ground in Gaza. But it's, you know, it's a matter of like, when does the U.S. cut its losses and realizes that like, oh, we can probably just operate through Saudi.
Yeah, or Egypt or Jordan
or Egypt. Yeah.
No, it is insane. It's Israeli society's contradictions are currently like tearing itself apart right now. It's tearing at the seams. Settler colonial state based on, you know, these mythoses that are sort of being unfurled. But I think what's really crazy is just that it's just a couple guys with guns in Palestine. Like the Al-Qassam brigades are obviously amazing, but it's just a couple guys with guns, effectively little military training, holding off the entire brunt of the Western world. Like that's I don't know. It's and also,
I mean, also that probably also plays in the fact that the Israeli military is very overly touted, despite them, a lot of them just being an overglorified 18-year-old police force with extra hardware.
Absolutely.
Which is something that I think a lot of people don't consider, is that outside of a couple of specialized brigades and operational units, the Israeli military is really nothing more than a bunch of dudes a bunch of women, you know, to be inclusive, who spend the majority of their
too.
Women can also do genocide.
Yeah,
you know, it's based. No, but like we have you know, this reality where a lot of Israelis in their conscription are undergoing like a standard basic training. A lot of them are getting desk jobs. A lot of them are going over to the West Bank and terrorizing a bunch of Palestinian children, and then like they're getting tossed into the fucking the fucking kill zone against very well trained, admittedly pretty well armed guerrilla factions and forces, not only in Gaza but Jenin as well, and areas in the West Bank. Like, you know, for all of the jokes around, you know, a couple of dudes with guns, which I think are really funny. You know, it's notable, like Al-Qassam is created and like Hamas and other Palestinian groups in tandem with them, because it's the whole coalitional effort of resistance factions. It really created this like fascinating network of both military operations as well as just like production facilities, like the sniper rifles that we're seeing used by Al-Qassam and a lot of their videography are homemade in Gaza. The ammunition's made in Gaza. The rockets that we're seeing, the Yassins, are homemade. Like they've created their own, under the confines of a total air, land, and sea blockade, their own military production apparatus that goes even beyond just the tunnels.
Yeah.
And it is so fascinating to see that sort of resilience, that sort of I guess capacity for growth under these extreme situations, and I guess the occasional hilarious North Korean RPG head. You know, it's just neat. I don't know. I have a lot of respect, I think, for resistance factions who have been able to, under these conditions, stave off their total annihilation. I think there's something to be said about that. It makes me optimistic even for us in the Imperial Core.
Absolutely. And I also think Israel's just sort of measuring victory in the wrong ways, right? Like Israel's measuring victory in terms of like civilians killed, in terms of bombs dropped, in terms of destruction, like very much like America in the Vietnam War. Like America in the Vietnam War, we measured victory by how many bombs we dropped onto Vietnam, which is the wrong way to like measure victory, right? Because the Al-Qassam brigade still mostly survive. You know, after almost a year within Gaza, they have not achieved any of their military victories.
And you know, it's interesting. Like I think recent reporting showed that only like 3 Al-Qassam brigades had been like functionally destroyed, with a lot of them being like substandard combat capacity but still existent. And Al-Qassam just keeps breaking in and reappearing after the Israelis try to clear areas like Al Shujaiya in northern Gaza. Uh, it's so fascinating to see that the Israelis are utilizing very similar command and control tactics and clearing tactics we saw in Vietnam and like against the Vietnamese military are just failing utterly. I think that's fascinating. And I think it's part of the reason why they're so determined to not get a ceasefire going is because the scale of their military failures in a post-mortem analysis is going to look a lot worse than what we currently have the ability to do. The Israelis, like the Americans, have a chronic tendency to undercount the amount of casualties they've got. There's a reason why we have like more than 1 million casualties that are like injuries coming out of Iraq with such a small official death toll, right?
Yeah, yeah, and I also think it's just sort of the hubris of a settler colonialist project where can't stop. You can't stop. It's part of your identity to take over the other, right? Like you got to show your superiority, and if you stop, it shows weakness. You show your own society weakness. That's why they can't. But you know, paradoxically, the more you put gas on this machine, on this war machine against guerrillas that you can never really get rid of. You can never really win against guerrillas who are organized the way that like the Vietnamese were, or the Palestinians are currently in Al-Qassam. You know, the more you put gas on this engine, the more the engine is likely to break. You know, just like the more likely you are to strain it and to crack it, things like that. If you want to pick up on anything I just said.
Yeah. No, I think it's an interesting bit, and you've seen this actually since the beginning of Zionist colonialism in Palestine, where the more that the project bears its fangs and the more violent force that the project imposes upon the Palestinian people, the less secure and the less stable ultimately its occupation becomes, as their actions are only reinforcing Palestinian national sentiments and this resistance against their own colonial project.
Yeah.
I think that's very interesting. And I think we're seeing that now too. It's that like we've even moved past largely. I mean, I think the majority of people now hear like just even like liberal talking points that were accepted for decades, like a two-state solution, and they're like, oh yeah, that's a fucking joke. Yeah, sure, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. Like,
absolutely.
we're seeing that play out. Like, you know, and it's like it's interesting how consciousness is raised through the continued and increasingly violent imposition of just horrific colonial tactics. Something to be said about that, I think.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it at some point a contradiction gets so bad that you have no choice but to face it. You know, like when you're sort of in that dreamlike hegemonic state that America sells you into. You know, it's very easy to sort of just lull yourself into sleep, to ignore the contradictions, get stuck in your 9 to 5, things like that. But when it gets to a point where it's even affecting you to some degree, you know, when you have like a material interest to stop it, you know, like you're looking at it and you're questioning like, why the fuck do I not have healthcare and Israelis have healthcare? Why the fuck do I not have free college, or my kids don't have free college and Israelis have free college? When it gets to that point, you're no longer able to stay in that dreamlike state. You have to wake up a little bit, just a little bit, you know, and I think that's happening to a lot of people. But also, I think a lot of people do sort of want to stay in that dreamlike state. Like, why do you think it is so easy for some Americans to sort of get detached from the harsh realities of genocide, like especially our liberal counterparts? How easy it is for them to just dismiss this genocide.
I think a lot of it is it's very difficult to reckon with the ongoing genocide and the legacy of U.S. support that's led to it without challenging a system that fundamentally benefits you.
Yeah.
And this maybe goes into the whole like concept of like labor aristocracy, or even this kind of third worldist defeatist positioning that we were talking about earlier, which is that like the U.S. working class, even the U.S. bourgeoisie, this capital class, all of us are very much
benefitters of it.
Very much able to be. We benefit majorly, yeah, and like some of us more than others, obviously. And I would argue that in some communities, even though you're seeing benefits, you might certainly not be able to fucking see them. But like, you know, we benefit from having the sort of market dominance, this sort of imperialist structures that we've imposed upon entire regions of the world, the entire world, really. We benefit so much from being this unquestioned hegemonic force. And you see it primarily in the ease of consumer access. I think that like for a very long time, the mechanism for placating what has been kind of a consistent decrease in the overall quality of life for Americans has been this ease of access to mass amounts of consumer goods. And that like this kind of emergence of like a quote unquote American middle class is less so born on like wages and like the ability for people to move up companies, and more so built on the transmission of incredibly cheap consumer goods that we gauge as being better when we're able to obtain them. Like, why struggle against the system when I have all the water and food I need, when I have a flat screen television, when I've got a house with a picket fence outside, 2 cars, and my kids are going to college, even if they're getting fucked. Like, it's really easy to ignore that, because it's really easy to ignore the pain that enables one to be a part of that system and benefit from that system. Because to stop ignoring it means you have to reevaluate your entire life. And it's kind of, it's uncomfortable, I think, for a lot of people.
Yeah.
It's easier just to flip on CNN and be like, oh yeah, that's fucked, and then turn it off and go play a game or some shit,
Yeah. I mean, it's both like a painful ego death, like to recognize that there is a horrible genocide going in Palestine, is to question the whole system of Americanism, everything you've been taught, your own personal identity itself. And that's a very painful ego death that I don't think many Americans are ready to confront. And also, I think it's just neoliberalism, just the way that the world currently is. It's so easy to just fall into escapism. Get into this like isolated little bubble, play video games at home. Like neoliberalism, late stage capitalism destroyed any sense of American community there was. And so we're all sort of like ideology over material world, right? Like we all escape into our minds, into like these ideological fantasies over what is actually really happening on the ground. And I think given that, like when you're so detached from your community that your entire world is entirely in your head, almost like ideological, when you don't even have like a third place to go to like bounce ideas off of other people, and you're just stuck in your suburban home or something like that. Given all that, it's just so easy to escape into liberal ideology. Like, oh, you know what? The Democrats can be pushed left, right? Like things just like that. It's a rejection of confronting reality, essentially.
Well, great. I mean, and also like the way that our society operates, the way, like you said, particularly in how easy it is to become separated from one's community, and by extension, the struggles that come with community, makes it so easy to tune out. Like you saw that during the BLM uprisings, like all these, like it was very easy for some people to retreat into the suburbs and just piss off, like, oh yeah, that rabble down in the downtown's insane. I'm going to stay here and go to my Kroger and stay inside, watch my television.
And I think online culture is part of that alienation. I think there's just so many things part of that alienation, where you're just sort of able to escape reality. And I think a lot of people would rather escape reality than have that painful ego death, because it is such a painful ego death to question, oh my God, is capitalism and imperialism and monopoly finance capitalism evil? Is this a Nazi system? Has this always been
my country
evil?
has to fall? It's like, shit.
Yeah.
We're not the good guys? Fuck. Like, it sucks, especially if you're someone who is like, I am of the opinion, nobody likes feeling like they've been taken for a fucking ride. Nobody likes feeling like they've been just bamboozled. And so you have so many people who are inundated with this idea of like American exceptionalism and American innocence, these like dual sword and shield concepts, and this whole idea of Americanism broadly. It's really difficult to like sit there and be like, fuck, I'm like 26 and I didn't even realize this was wrong until like 22.
Yeah.
You're like, damn, like the majority of my life I've been living like a fucking lie. That's a difficult conversation, even more so for people who are like older, people who have like real ideological commitment to the project we exist in. Like, it's fucking hard. And it's why it's so easy, I think, to get people to be like, no, like there's problems, yeah, for sure, but like, the system's working the best it can, right? That's the whole out, is we get close and then we avoid it, because like to question the system is to question the very existence of the state that we have lived in for so long.
And
it's a terrifying concept.
Yeah, and absolutely, I do think third worldism, the theory of labor aristocracy, is true.
Yeah,
in part, like
absolutely.
we absolutely are materially paid off to not care about the third world, to not to care about the
Oh yeah.
global south. You get a pretty good stinking deal in America. I feel like even if you are poor, things like that. Even if you are like on the edge, at least you're not facing bombs, you know, and you can still go to Walmart and get a pretty decently priced, I don't know, like iPhone for like not
Mhm.
iPhone, but like a Verifone for like $70. Like you can get like a Timu
Yeah.
Life, you know, basically in America. That's just good enough, you know. And I think the system works just enough for enough people that a lot of people are not revolutionary. You know, the only time people actually become revolutionary is when they have no alternative, right? Like
Yeah.
nobody's gonna the revolution to be revolutionary requires you to like actually accept that my life is worse than death, and I would rather
Hmm.
die than continue living this life. And I think that only
Absolutely.
really happens in like the weakest link, weakest chain countries. You know, it was Vietnam, you know, Tsarist Russia, but America. I think for now the system works for enough of a certain section of the population that they're fine, but that section of the population is declining. Right, like every single year,
Mhm.
there's less and less people that the system works enough for them to preserve it. And I think America has just been on a steady decline for a long time, just sort of slow death, slow, long, drawn out death. If you want to pick up any of those points.
Oh, I agree. I mean, like, you know, to come back to the point, like in the U.S., it's very easy to for a lot of people. I think there's nuance to this. Like, you know, there are populations or certain subsections of groups that like do face what I would describe as like really fucking horrific conditions.
Yeah, yeah,
Like homeless friends of mine deal with just horrent shit all of the time because you are at that point facing the real brunt end of a system that is built on death and only values you
absolutely.
so far as you are able to consume and produce. Um, but you know, the majority of people, I would say, the vast swaths of people are easy. You know, they might say, "Well, I'm struggling day to day. Like my bills suck, my rent's too high, I don't have health care, whatever." But you are still not drinking water from a puddle in the middle of fucking Gaza under
Yeah,
total military occupation, wondering if a drone's going to come and shoot you in your tent. And there is a real difference, I think, between those two lived experiences. I don't know if you have to get to that point to become truly engaged in radical theory and praxis.
no, no,
I
no.
do think I do think there's something to be said about how material comforts in the imperial core really do neuter a lot of the potential for revolutionary development in a way that's ultimately really fucking harmful.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you can absolutely like individuals can become revolutionary and be like materially incentivized to like be. I mean, Engels, for crying out loud, was the son of a factory owner, things like that. But I think for like large movements the system has to break, right? Like for large section of the population to become revolutionary, the system has to break where it's not even working for them. That's what I would say to clarify my
Mhm.
point.
For
um
sure, for sure.
yeah, yeah. But you know, you talk a lot about Palestine. You try to just simplify these concepts. What would you tell to let's say a grandma, you know, who doesn't really follow this, why you support violent Palestinian liberation?
It's actually so funny. This is a conversation I've had to have with my grandma. Like, you know, a lot of like the way that I frame it to my family, in particular around Gaza, is I think we can all understand on a base level that if you lock someone in a cage for years on end and then poke them with a stick and prod them and make it to where they can't physically actually live a life that is without total life spanning domination of every decision they make, that yes, people are going to try to break out of that structure. And they, you know, a lot of people I think can personally understand on some level why, if you are someone whose like parents were killed, if you're someone who has seen your friends and community bombarded, if you're someone who is, you know, living in a prison your entire life, and you're correctly identifying that there is a very concrete actor responsible for this pain, that you are going to do everything you can to liberate yourself from that suffering. And that's, I think, it's like as an individual, if I were in even a quarter of the conditions that the average Palestinian in like northern Gaza is in, I would be hitting the streets and I would be burning shit down.
Yeah.
And in a lot of ways, I think that Palestinians have shown an immense amount of restraint.
Absolutely.
When you look at their response to this kind of colonialism, and I don't say that to my grandma, but like that's like a personal belief. It's like you look at all of this pain and suffering, and you look at like what the driving factor is, and it's not Palestinians on October 7th. It is decades of this really violent structure that is meant to disenfranchise and displace and ultimately erase this group of people. And when you're in that group, getting erased, disenfranchised, exploited, brutalized, put in prisons, assaulted in these prisons in your day-to-day, you're gonna develop like very harsh feelings against the system, and understandably, justifiably so. And when we are looking at, how do we create something better if you don't like violence, which I don't think anyone really adores it, you have to stop what the catalyst in the system. You have to stop what is the primary source of violence in the system that is creating the cycle of violence. And that is the colonial project. It's the actor themselves. And there's an easy solution to this, which is, and not an easy solution, I guess, like beyond on paper, but there is an easy outcome here that stops a lot of this violence, if not all of it, is literally decolonization, is an establishment of a singular state that is not built on white supremacy, settler colonialism, and just imperialism. For me, that's the big thing. If you really want everybody to be able to live a life that is worthwhile for them, you have to admit that like there's a core problem that goes well beyond the guns that Al-Qassam is holding.
Absolutely.
And that's how I kind of frame it to my family, at least. And my mother actually has become a lot more understanding of my positions, kind of specifically with the jail references, because she's like, no, I get it. Like, I understand why you would resist that. But people, I think, have this tendency to love resistance or decolonial struggle in an abstract and really fucking feel uncomfortable when it happens. You see that in Algeria, with the in Ireland. There's this whole conversation around like, yeah, no, like up the raw, but like those bombings were pretty tough. And like there's a conversation to be had about that, I think. But like there's a lot of like acceptance amongst a lot of people that I've met for this need for resistance or for understanding the concept. But it's the nitty-gritty details that everyone gets really uncomfortable with. And I think that's a very interesting dynamic as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think so many people are raised into this like idealist sort of conception of how the world works, where like you would flip on any TV show or media, or like our whole society sort of idolizes peace, right? Like peaceful solutions, but there are just some systems of violence where they cannot be overcome with peace, and I think that's just very hard for a lot of people to wrap their minds around, especially when that violence is so hard to see, right? Like when it's so systematized, like white supremacy within America is hard to place your finger on, especially as it operates currently, post civil rights. But in Israel, that veil has sort of Israel-Palestine, that veil has sort of gone away completely. Like you can see the violence very directly, whereas before maybe during like the Oslo Accord period, that violence was more like, we're blocking food to you and we're counting your calories, but we're not going out in mass. Well, of course there were parts where they did go out in mass and shoot people, but like to the scale that they're doing now, bombing like whole cities. But now it is almost unconfrontable, this violence. And of course, what is the solution to that? We cannot all hold hands and sing Kumbaya when this is happening, and I think that's just something that a lot of people need to understand, that peaceful solutions come from a sort of almost place of privilege. A lot of communities within this world, especially within these sociological societies, do not have that option.
Mhm. Agreed.
Yeah. Yeah. So you know what? Let's wrap this up. We've been talking for like an hour, 20 minutes. I'll just give you the last
No
question.
worries.
Uh,
Yeah.
let's. How do you think the Roblox ban in Turkey will affect global politics?
I hope it like leads to an independent Kurdish Eastern bloc. No, I'm just kidding. I don't know. That'd be pretty cool.
Did you see the kid? Oh my god, the kids protesting was so fucking
Yeah, I
cute.
know.
Oh,
In
yeah.
the street, that shit is
Yeah.
awesome. Like, I love it. I mean, hey, engage the youth, I guess. That shit's hilarious. Like,
Yeah, you know,
Roblox is so fun.
I know, and the Gen Alpha kids have been organizing for Palestine and Roblox in
Yeah,
Malaysia.
yeah, I see
you know?
videos of it.
Yeah.
It makes me so happy. Like,
I love Gen
God.
Alpha, but
they're really kicking it, man. I'm happy for them, and I love like yeah I teared up when I saw the first little Roblox Palestine protest. I was like, this is awesome. Like
I know. All my cousins play Roblox. It's cute. It's a cute game. They'll make me play it.
it's awesome.
It is. I love Gen Alpha. I work with Gen Alpha. I work in schools. Yeah, those kids are smart. You know, like
Oh yeah,
they know a lot of things about the world, like because of their iPads, because they're so connected. Like they're not as disconnected as Gen Z used to be, you know, to everything. You know, they'll even ask me like which side of the debate I'm on, like Kendrick or Drake. I'm like, how the fuck do you know that? Like you should not
like,
know the Kendrick.
You're 6. What are you talking about?
Yeah, but James, it's been a wonderful conversation. Tell people where they can find you, and if you have any concluding remarks.
Yeah. So as far as where you can find me, I'm on Twitter at Good Vibe Politique. I am on TikTok as James Gets Political. I also have I write for Mondaweiss. I'm a contributor there, and so you can find my pieces on Mondaweiss. Just typing in James Ray Mondaweiss to pull up my page. You can see all the articles I've written. Not a whole lot so far, but I'm getting more as we go. And that's a big deal, I guess. Closing thoughts. An interesting story, maybe. During the revolt, the Great Palestinian Revolt, back in the 1900s, there was this interesting story that I came across recently in a podcast that I listened to called the Preoccupation Podcast, and it's this the story of one Palestinian man who was coming back during the revolt period. Actually, was one of the few Palestinians. This is a very interesting little tidbit, who had Ottoman military academy experience, and this is very notable in Palestine because there weren't a lot of Palestinians who had that. Palestine, interestingly enough, in terms of like military training in the Ottomans, was underrepresented compared to like Iraq, Syria, and elsewhere. But this one guy and a handful of military officers that came with him, people he was training, bringing together a lot of these revolutionary groups that were otherwise sort of sporadic, what have you. I have to say he's like a great man theory, but he helped to bring together and thread together a lot of these military operations. At one point, the British were coming in, and they were in the midst of their repression, and they were coming into this, I believe, village. And the British ended up embedded in this war in this battle for hours, which they were never accustomed to. British occupational forces expected to go in, slaughter, kick it quick. And so the British did what imperialists do, and they brought in air support. They brought in planes because in British imperial planning, if you had air dominance and you were able to, if your ground troops were halted, bring in the planes, bomb the natives, get them out of here. And there was a moment of shock in the British when they realized that this man, who, again, had Ottoman military training, shot down one of their planes. He had brought in anti-aircraft devices in a way that the British had not expected or anticipated. The British were so pissed that they scrambled another plane that was also shot down by that same anti-aircraft battery, just challenging the mechanisms of imperial dominance in a way that is so inspiring. And though that revolt pittered out, there was an optimism amongst those Palestinians in that moment that they could take on the most powerful fucking entity in the world at the time and win. And I think it's awesome that decades later, even though they did not get to realize that liberation, we are closer than ever to their optimism. coming to fruition with the establishment of a single decolonized Palestinian state. And I think that's very interesting.
Death to America. The enemy is a paper tiger. Free Palestine.
Absolutely.
And James, thank you for coming on.
Of course. Have a good one.
Yeah, you too. This episode of the Pokepreet Pod has been brought to you by our generous members on our Patreon. If you'd like to become one of them, go to patreon.com/thepokepreetpod. Thank you. What the fuck? Glory to Stalin. I barely... And a special shout out to our Marshal of the Soviet Union member, Matthias T. If you'd also like a shout out, please consider subscribing to our Patreon, where you can also get episodes up to a month early. Thank you.